My name is Kelly Smith, and I work on navigation and guidance for Orion. 3,600 miles above Earth. 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
What does it mean? We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. In the 1960s, the radiation received by the astronauts was the equivalent of a simple X-ray. And today, we must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space? We are thus faced with a puzzling situation. Up until 1968, the Van Allen belts were considered very dangerous by the scientific community at large. Then, during the Apollo missions, they were suddenly no longer dangerous and could be safely crossed. While in recent times, they have gone back to be considered very dangerous. Even modern astronauts, curiously, admit that we are currently unable to go beyond the low Earth orbit, and that perhaps one day we may be able to reach the Moon and other planets.
The plan that NASA has is to build a rocket called SLS, which is a heavy lift rocket. It's something that is much bigger than what we have today, and it will be able to launch the Orion capsule with humans on board, as well as landers or other components to destinations beyond Earth orbit. Right now, we only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. And this new system that we're building is going to allow us to go beyond and hopefully take humans into the solar system to explore. So the Moon, Mars, asteroids, there's a lot of destinations that we could go to, and we're building these building block components in order to allow us to do that eventually.
And certainly this interview with astronaut Alan Bean doesn't help us clarify the situation. As a crew member of the Apollo 12 mission, Bean is theoretically one of the very few human beings to have ever crossed the Van Allen belts. And yet, not only isn't he sure of having ever reached them, but in fact he doesn't even know where the belts are located.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No. Now, I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
And listen to Bean's reply when he is told that the Van Allen belts are located between the Earth and the Moon.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
Then we went right out through them.
It's a curious response indeed. After all, Activisimo himself wrote in his book, all astronauts are trained in plotting trajectories, rendezvous, and orbits by using a ruler, and in orientation by using the stars. Are we truly to believe that one of the few astronauts who ever crossed the Van Allen belts doesn't even know where they are? Or maybe Alan Bean, in a moment of distraction, has let an uncomfortable truth slip out by mistake.
I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt.
Question. Can you explain why NASA, despite everything Van Allen had written on the dangers of radiation, has sent the first astronauts through the radioactive belts without any specific protection and without even sending a monkey first in order to evaluate the effects of radiation on a biological organism as complex as the human being? If it were true, like the debunkers maintain, that a lunar mission entails a total of radiation equivalent to an X-ray, why does NASA describe today the Van Allen belts as an area of dangerous radiation? If it's true, like NASA maintains, that during the trip to the Moon 50 years ago, the astronaut doses were negligible, why does NASA state today, in regards to the Van Allen belts, that we must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space? How is it possible that one of the very few astronauts to have ever crossed the Van Allen belts doesn't even know where they are, and even doubts having gone far enough out to encounter the Van Allen belts? Let's now discuss the actual lunar landings. We will start by examining the lunar spaceship, or LEM, which has allegedly brought 12 astronauts to walk on the surface of the moon in the course of 6 different missions. The LEM, or Lunar Module, is the vehicle that was designed to carry astronauts to the surface of the moon. But this very LEM raises so many questions that many doubt this vehicle has actually ever reached the moon. They suspect this is only a mock-up model sitting on a movie set instead. Seen from a distance, the LEM appears like a technological wonder. But once we get up close, we realize that it looks more like a mock-up model, somehow put together with steel tubes and papier-mâché, held together with simple Scotch tape. What immediately catches the eye is the large amounts of Scotch tape haphazardly placed here and there, as if it were a last-minute job. With temperatures that can reach over 200 degrees in the sun, doesn't seem like a smart idea to use Scotch tape everywhere. The debunkers, however, claim that there is a specific reason for the use of Scotch tape.
Una delle teorie, per esempio, è che il modulo lunare è rivestito di lamierino. Si vede addirittura che è unito con lo scotch, quindi era un simulacro di cartapesta. No, non è vero, perché si va a vedere la documentazione tecnica e salta fuori che il modo migliore per applicare senza aggravare il peso il rivestimento termico in modo che non venisse surriscaldato dal sole era di usare dei giunti adesivi invece della rivettatura che con la dilatazione termica avrebbero causato delle sollecitazioni.
But this explanation doesn't stand to scrutiny. As one can see, the LEM is full of metal rivets everywhere. There is therefore no explanation for the sloppiness in the construction of the lunar module, with the engines covered with aluminum foil, the external panels not even lining up with each other, and the Scotch tape that seems added at the last moment, just to keep together pieces that would otherwise fall apart. The lunar module cost over $2 billion at the time, which is the equivalent of $21 billion in 2016 currency. Are we truly to believe that NASA has spent all this money to send a vehicle covered with loose pieces of cardboard into space? The second problem posed by the LEM is that there is no crater in the sand caused by the jet of the engine during the landing. According to the debunkers, this crater should not exist at all, because the LEM uses very little power when it lands, they say. And it does so on a rocky volcanic surface anyway.
Sulla Luna, essendoci un sesto di gravità, il peso che deve essere sostenuto dal motore è un sesto, quindi la spinta che viene scaricata sul terreno è molto modesta. Non c'è motivo di produrre un cratere, oltretutto in una superficie rocciosa, di roccia vulcanica come è quella della Luna.
But the surface where the LEM supposedly landed is not rocky at all, like Attivissimo claims. Neil Armstrong himself refutes this statement when he describes a fine-grained, almost powdery surface instead.
The surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder.
A similar comment is made by Alan Shepard, one of the astronauts from Apollo 14.
The soil is so soft that it comes up all the way to the top of the footpath.
James Irwin from Apollo 15 even describes a layer of soft soil.
Boy, that's really soft dirt there around the front footpath. Sure is. Like about 6 inches deep of soft material.
In fact, during the landing approach, we can clearly see large amounts of dust being blown away by the LEM's engine. But then, why is there no hollow underneath? This animation helps us better understand what should have happened during the landing on the moon. Just like this leaf blower, which blows away the dust on the surface and reveals the hard rock underneath, we would expect to see a hollow in the sand under the LEM, revealing the hard terrain under the surface. But the hollow is not there. This animation shows the landing of the Phoenix probe on Mars, which took place in 2008. As one can see, the Phoenix also uses rockets to land on the surface of the planet. And these are the actual images sent back to Earth by the Phoenix after it landed. As one can see, the sand on the surface has been blown away by the rockets, which are seen above, revealing the hard terrain underneath. Why hasn't the same thing happened under the lunar module? Question: if a simple leaf blower can remove the dust from the surface, revealing the hard rock underneath, why has the same not happened under the engine of the LEM? And why do we still see several pebbles sitting under the engine, which weren't even blown away during the landing of the LEM? Given that James Irwin described about 6 inches deep of soft material around the footpads, why is there no hole in the sand under his LEM's engine cone? A problem connected to the missing crater under the rocket is the total absence of dust in the landing footpads. If this is the dust being blown in all directions during the landing, why is there no trace of the dust in the footpads whatsoever? In this case, Attivissimo seems to have a very particular explanation as well.
La prima missione era molto sperimentale e gli ordini erano: appena tocchi il suolo devi spegnere il motore. Invece era tanta l'emozione e la tensione di quel primo allunaggio che non si sono ricordati di spegnere il motore. Lasciando il motore acceso, spazzano via tutta la polvere che c'è intorno al modulo lunare ed è per questo che le zampe sono pulite.
But the statement by Attivissimo is demonstrably false. All one has to do is check the original video from the landing of Apollo 11 to realize that Armstrong orders the engine shut off right after the contact lights have come on, which is before the LEM actually touches the ground.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent.
Also, in the statement released after the mission, Armstrong confirms that the engine shutoff took place just before the LEM touched the ground.
In any case, the engine shutdown was not very high above the surface. It was quite close.
Furthermore, the absence of dust in the footpads can also be noticed in other missions, such as Apollo 12 or Apollo 14, which means the explanation by Attivissimo is not valid anyway. In any case, the debunkers must make up their mind. You cannot maintain that the jet from the engine was too weak to create a hollow in the sand, and yet strong enough to completely blow off the sand from the footpads during the moon landing. One of the two statements must be false. We then ask the following questions. Given that this is the amount of dust thrown around by the descent engine, why is there no dust whatsoever in the LEM's footpads? How is it possible that the jet from the engine is at the same time strong enough to wipe the footpads clean, but weak enough not to even form a crater in the sand during the moon landing? Let's now examine one of the most important problems regarding the LEM: the absence of a visible flame under the engine during the departure from the moon. The lunar module consisted of 2 separate blocks placed one above the other. Each block was equipped with an independent engine. The first one was used to land the entire spaceship on the lunar surface. The second was used for the liftoff of the upper part of the spaceship, the one carrying the astronauts. Both engines used a special kind of fuel called hypergolic. This is a fuel that burns on simple contact between 2 chemical components, with no need for an actual ignition system. The debunkers claim that the reason for the missing flame is due precisely to the use of hypergolic fuel. On his website, Bad Astronomy, debunker Phil Plait writes, "There is actually a simple reason why you cannot see the flame from the lander when it took off. The fuels they used produced no visible flame." In his book, Attivissimo also writes, "The product of combustion from these fuels is colorless and transparent. This is why there is no flame under the LEM when it takes off." But these statements are false. Hypergolic fuels produce a clearly visible flame, both on Earth and in the vacuum of space. This is a test from the engine of the rocket SpaceX, which uses hypergolic fuel. As one can see, the flame is clearly visible during the combustion. And this is a test of the LEM's ascent engine, exactly the one we are discussing now.
To keep it simple, it used so-called hypergolic propellants, a rocket fuel and an oxidizer that explode on contact.
The long flame from the hypergolic fuel is clearly visible under the LEM's engine during combustion. In the original images from the Apollo missions, however, there is no visible flame. This is Apollo 15 lifting off from the moon. This is Apollo 16.
And who took the picture of this 17. Lifting off?
In all cases,
how did they pan it up as the flame was, as the LEM was going up?
Some might think that hypergolic fuel, which is clearly visible on Earth, for some reason may become invisible in the vacuum of space. But it is not so, and there are several examples to prove it. This is a Draco engine, which uses hypergolic fuel tested in a vacuum chamber. As one can see, the flame produced by the engine is clearly visible. The Space Shuttle also uses hypergolic fuel for its orientation rockets, and the emissions from the rockets are clearly visible during the maneuvers in the vacuum of space. Obviously, in order to verify whether the lunar module was actually capable of landing and taking off from the moon, all one would have to do is to take the original designs from the LEM and feed them into a modern simulation computer. With today's computers, it would be very easy to verify all of the LEM's functionalities without the need of actually sending the machine into space. Unfortunately, though, the original designs from the lunar module are nowhere to be found. Apparently, Grumman, the construction company, chose to get rid of them because they took up too much space. To justify this incomprehensible act, the debunking website Clavius writes, Grumman is an aerospace engineering firm, not a museum. It did not wish to house the 100,000 cubic feet or so of design documentation at its expense. But then, why not donate them to a museum? The LEM is the only machine that has ever carried human beings onto another celestial body. Its historical value is unique, and there must be dozens of museums around the world that would have killed just to be able to display its construction designs. Instead, we are asked to believe that all this documentation has been turned into trash just because there wasn't enough space to store it. Even more disconcerting than the disappearance of the LEM designs is the disappearance of the original tapes that contained the images from the first moonwalk by Neil Armstrong.
Now, nearly 40 years after the first moon landing, NASA has confessed that the original film depicting Neil Armstrong's giant leap has been lost. Well, not lost, says NASA, just can't be found.
We are simply talking about the single most important document in the history of mankind. The first step of a human being on another celestial body, which was recorded on magnetic tape by the receiving stations on Earth. As such, one would expect these tapes to be kept under lock in a thermally controlled environment in a place accessible only to a restricted number of people. Instead, NASA candidly tells us that the original tapes no longer exist. So shocking was this fact that filmmaker Aaron Rannon wanted to verify it in person, interviewing the former flight director of the Apollo 11 mission, Gene Kranz.
I haven't seen anything that indicates the telemetry data is even in existence, and as I said, even if we had it, we don't have the machines to play it back.
But your own research has shown the telemetry data is missing.
That's right.
Also from NASA's official archives at Goddard Space Center in Maryland, Aaron Rannon received the same embarrassing answer.
We've been unable to track it down. I mean, we don't know where this telemetry data ended up, and we don't know what path it may have taken. So, unfortunately, I'm afraid I can't really give you much of a clue as to where this data ended up and whether it still exists or not.
But listen to what the explanation by the debunkers is for this inconceivable fact.
L'ha persa per una ragione puramente burocratica. All'epoca questi nastri erano considerati inutilizzabili. La registrazione del segnale televisivo fuori standard fu registrata su una traccia dei nastri di telemetria, quelli che davano le pulsazioni, lo stato del veicolo e via dicendo. Secondo prassi, dopo un certo numero di anni, i dati di telemetria delle missioni, se non li chiama più nessuno, vengono mandati alla cancellazione, perché i nastri costano e allora non si lasciano lì a marcire, si smagnetizzano, si riutilizzano.
So, according to Activissimo, there is an actual procedure at NASA that leads to the automatic cancellation of tapes if people no longer request them, even if those tapes contain simply the most important documentation in the history of mankind. One thing should be clear. In itself, the loss of the original tapes of the moonwalk would not represent an irreparable damage. There are copies of the same moonwalk recently digitalized which are even better than the lost original. The problem is that besides the moonwalk, those tapes also contain some important telemetry data, ranging from the astronaut's heartbeat to the very location of the LEM in space at the time. This means that if the LEM had not found itself on the surface of the moon at that time, or if the situation on board had been any different from what we were told, the telemetry data would have clearly revealed it. So, if one chooses to, he can believe the story of the tapes that were erased because they were too expensive. For everyone else, one question becomes unavoidable. What was so important in those tapes that NASA had to come up with such a preposterous excuse just to ensure they would no longer be available to scientists and researchers from modern times? Let's now take a closer look at the telecommunications between Earth and the Moon. There are several elements that don't add up in this area, like, for example, the delay in the radio communications between Houston and the astronauts. The Earth and the Moon are about 240,000 miles apart. For this reason, a radio signal takes about 1.3 seconds to reach our satellite and another 1.3 seconds to come back to Earth. This means that when Houston asked a question to the astronauts on the Moon, the reply should have taken at least 2.6 seconds to come back to Earth. 1.3 seconds for the question to reach the astronaut, 1.3 seconds for his answer to come back. There are some cases, however, where the answer from the astronaut comes back much faster. Here is one example.
Roger, Jim, copy. And are you progressing towards Dune Crater now?
Yes.
The answer is almost immediate. It takes a little over a second for it to come back.
Roger, Jim, copy. And are you progressing towards Dune Crater now?
Yes.
This is the soundtrack from the original audio. This segment contains the question coming from Houston, and this is the answer by the astronaut. The gap between the end of the question and the answer is only 1.1 seconds.
Roger, Jim, copy. And are you progressing towards Dune Crater now?
Yes.
Too short for this communication to have really come from the Moon. To examine the audio delays, we have obviously used the original, unmodified tapes from NASA distributed around the world by Spacecraft Films. If there is one thing everybody agrees on, it's that the DVDs by Spacecraft Films are the only originals that can be used as reference for any kind of research. Paolo Attivissimo confirms this in one of his conferences.
Poi ci sono i DVD come questo qui, Apollo 11, c'è tutta la serie, sono tutte le trasmissioni televisive che sono state fatte in diretta, lo sbarco, tutto. Quello è il riferimento. Se c'è una falsificazione è lì che la dobbiamo cercare, non è sulla copia trovata su YouTube. Questa è la versione di riferimento.
In this conference, Attivissimo also confirms that the original tapes are unedited and uncut.
DVD come questo, che si possono comprare tranquillamente su internet o dove volete, contengono tutte le riprese originali. Tutto. Senza censure, senza tagli, senza rimontaggi, esattamente così come è arrivato.
The same thing is confirmed by Clavius, one of the most authoritative debunking websites on the Luna issue. The DVDs by Spacecraft Films, writes Clavius, contain the digital transfers of original Apollo film and video unedited. What is interesting is that if one checks the Apollo Journal website instead, where NASA has reloaded the Luna transmissions, broken up in small clips, the audio delay appears to be inserted correctly. This is the audio track from the same scene downloaded from the Apollo Journal. The question coming from Houston is unchanged, while the answer seems to have been moved up to some 4 seconds later.
Roger, Jim, copy. And are you progressing towards Dune Crater now?
Yes.
It's as if someone, in reloading the clip, had realized that the answer came too soon and had inserted a pause to produce the proper delay. But in the original audio from spacecraft films, this delay does not exist. This conversation cannot have taken place between the Earth and the Moon. Another example where the astronaut's answer comes too quickly.
We're interested in either documented samples or rake sample there if you think it looks like a good area for a rake sample.
Okay, understand, Joe.
1.6 seconds. The reply comes at least 1 second too soon for having originated on the Moon. There's even one case from the same mission where the answer takes less than a second to come back to base.
Rover, this is Houston.
Go ahead.
9/10 of a second to be exact. It's as if this astronaut were standing in a room next door rather than actually being on the Moon.
Rover, this is Houston.
Go ahead.
Question. Given that we have examined the original videos from spacecraft films and that the debunkers themselves acknowledge that these videos are unedited and uncut, can you explain why, in several instances, the delay between the question and the answer is far shorter than it should be if the conversation had truly taken place between the Earth and the Moon?